Hello there. Welcome to Critical Weight Theory. Now, I listen to a lot of different music genres, but every once in a while I have to get back to some gritty, rhythmic slide guitar. And that's what we're talking about today. We're going to be looking at a man whose music wasn't flashy, wasn't polished, and wasn't trying to be anything it wasn't. And that's exactly why it hits so hard even today. I'm talking about Mississippi Fred McDowell, a slide guitar master, a folk blues icon, and one of the rawest voices ever captured on tape. He once said, "I do not play no rock and roll, but the truth is rock and roll wouldn't be the same without him." And let's get into that a little bit. So, Fred McDowell wasn't born in Mississippi, believe it or not. He came from Rossville, Tennessee, but the music that came out of him, that was pure Mississippi hill country, as it's called. Different from the Delta blues, which gets most of the headlines, hill country blues is all about rhythm, repetition, and groove. It's sort of hypnotic, maybe even trance-like. You feel it almost more than you follow it. So Fred played slide guitar like a man possessed, using a metal slide, sometimes a pocket knife, even a beef rib bone early on. I'd like to hear those recordings. Um, but he tuned to open chords and just locked in. And the average track, you're going to find it really is sort of hypnotic. There As far as I know, there are no fancy solos, no frills, just a steady pulse and a voice that cuts straight through the noise. And he was a bit of a late bloomer, although he was an instant legend. That's really the wild part about him. Fred wasn't discovered until he was in his mid 50s. So think about that. And if you're a musician, especially a quality musician, who's struggling and maybe feeling dispirited because you're not enjoying success at all in your earlier years or even in your in the middle of your life. Well, oddly enough, this is an example of somebody who kind of was in that same boat. He was a sharecropper working the fields by day, playing local juke joints at night. That changed in 1959 when Alan Lomax and Shirley Collins rolled through and recorded him for the Library of Congress. Low budget, raw field recordings that introduced McDowell to the world. From there, he became part of the 1960s folk blues revival, sharing stages at festivals and clubs with artists half his age and influencing them in the process. One of those artists was Bonnie Raitt. She studied his slide guitar style pretty closely, and if you've heard her play, you might pick up on some of her Fred McDowell influence. So am I saying that, if you're struggling, you're guaranteed to have that same level of success? Well, of course not, but it's a way of saying, hey, maybe there's a glimmer of hope. You might have some success if you just keep at it. Maybe improve your playing a little bit here and there, tweak things, and maybe you'll cultivate an audience, and you'll have things fall into place in just the right way. And of course, a little bit of hard work and determination, that's a factor as well. But this is really a story of somebody who did have some luck. The stars aligned, I suppose you might say. And if you're into blues music, you've probably already heard of this guy because he's essential listening. If you're wondering where to start with Fred's music, here's a short list. There's an album called Fred McDowell from 1959, the first Lomax recordings, and they're raw, intimate, like he's playing in the next room. Then there's his album I Do Not Play No Rock and Roll, which I sort of alluded to earlier. That was released in 1969. Actually, his electric guitar phase, still traditional, still gritty, but louder, and a declaration and a statement piece. And there is another album called Mississippi Fred McDowell, the Alan Lomax recordings, which is considered a time capsule of Southern blues, untouched by studio gloss. So I'm personally not sure the difference between that and the 1959 release, but there probably is some distinction. I'm not sure, but you might want to check out all of these albums if you have the time and the interest. And his 1965 album, Mississippi Delta Blues, also helped open doors, even though technically he wasn't from the Delta. That doesn't matter that much, though. The music speaks louder than geography. And I've kind of got into this discussion before about genre and geography because there's some people who think that the Chicago blues sound has to be originated from Chicago. Other people will say, that grunge has to come from Seattle. Well, I think there are some musical artists who at least dabbled in the grunge feel who weren't from Seattle, and it seems a little odd to just associate a genre of music with uh, geographical location, especially in some rigid way. And especially if you consider that all of the influences on those bands or individual performers, they probably didn't all come from that one location. So really if you look into the roots of these artists, they're usually able to debunk that sort of attempt to pin a genre down to just one area. Anyway, this is another blues musician who, sure, he didn't invent the blues, but he preserved a version of it that felt older, deeper, and perhaps closer to its African roots, I guess you could say. His style left fingerprints on uh, basically any type of music that is raw. You could probably detect some of these sensibilities in garage rock, modern blues, and probably bands like North Mississippi All Stars. His influence is heard in plenty of raw, emotional slide guitar riffs that don't try to be pretty and they're just honest, because that's really a lot of what the Mississippi Fred McDowell sound entails. Just it's almost like the songs have a life of their own, like they were somehow just born preformed. That probably sounds silly to put it like that, but it has that kind of vibe. That the songs aren't really trying to be anything but what they are in that moment that they were recorded. And yeah, rock stars may have polished things up, but they still borrow from the unfancy soul that Fred brought to every song. And Fred McDowell passed away in 1972, but his voice, his groove, and his slide are still very much alive in American music. And he didn't chase fame, he didn't change to fit trends, well, unless you think of his adaptation of the electric guitar qualifies as that. But still, maybe that wasn't just him chasing trends. Maybe it was him trying to augment his sound and liven things up for his own uh, benefit. And maybe that's why his music still feels timeless, because he was willing to put himself into his songs, and that was really all it required, just that genuine sense of who he was, that's really translated into the sounds that you hear. And real music always finds its way through. So even though he's probably not going to be having some superstar resurgence anytime soon, you should still check this guy out if you haven't listened to him before. I haven't listened to him often enough. It's hard to get around to listening to everybody, of course. But this, this music by Mississippi Fred McDowell, it kind of makes me want to get back into playing slide guitar myself because I don't really do that often enough. And it's a really cool approach that he's got. And if you want a breakdown of McDowell's guitar technique or how his sound connects to artists like Bonnie Raitt, you know, uh, you might want to look into more of that yourself because it is kind of an interesting little side topic here. And anyway, keep listening for the real ones like this. And if you ever want to hear some really cool slide guitar that's rhythmic and raw, definitely consider checking him out.